All right, folks, it's Wednesday night, 9 o'clock Eastern time. That means only one thing. We are talking SEC football nonstop here on SEC Breakdown with the best bloggers in the conference. It's all up to one tonight. Mr. Chad Niepling of Gridiron Now joining us. And Chad, hey, it's always a good talk. Finally could get you back on here.
Yeah, it's been a hiatus on my part, relocation with my family and I. So we've been I've kind of been in and out of the sports and social networking, but getting caught back up and going to be working with the guys at Gridiron Now and working with that group. That's the who's who of some very elite sports media people there, personalities. So I was very privileged to have the opportunity to join them, and I'll be covering SEC along with Arkansas pretty closely. That'll be part of my assignment. So excited to be a part of it, and man, glad to be back on here with you, Mark. Missed you guys, and so this is gonna be fun.
Yeah, it's definitely some prestigious stuff. I've checked out the website a number of times myself and look forward to seeing you on there and having you come back on here and always sharing the knowledge. So story number one, there's no question about it this week, comes out of Alabama camp. All-American left tackle Cam Robinson, defensive back Lawrence Hootie Jones, insignificant on the field for him right now, although he was very highly recruited at the time. Arrested early Tuesday morning in Monroe, Louisiana. Robinson charged with misdemeanors of possession and carrying a weapon in the presence of narcotics. Also charged with the possession of stolen firearms, which is listed as a felony. Robinson's bond was set later. Jones charged with the same misdemeanors as Cam Robinson, but not the felony. And so there's the situation there. Is the arrest occurred around 4 a.m. The police report says that they spotted the pair's car after hours at Forsyth Park. The park was closed. They approached the car. They caught the scent of marijuana. They got close enough, saw the handgun lying in the lap of one of the players. They arrested both of them, found a bag of marijuana on the driver's side floorboard and a stolen handgun under the seat. So a couple firearms and then the marijuana as well, Chad. So this looks horrible, but if we put it in perspective of some other issues we've seen like this and some of the issues you brought to light as we discussed this before we came on the air, you know, we can kind of temper it to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think you kind of have to at this point. You look at Cam, a very very solid individual. You know, he's not a guy that's a troublemaker. He's not a guy that came out of high school going into college that you considered to be a quote unquote thug, a guy that was out banging, whatever it may be. You know, it's a horrible situation, and I think had this happened at a different time when it wasn't the off season and everybody's looking for some headline to click on, I don't know how much of this would actually, would actually be that big of a deal. I think we'd be talking about it if it was definitely during the season because of the fact that he'd be missing games. But that being said, it's going to get blown out of proportion a little bit more because everybody's going to put a little different spin and opinion on it. That being said, defense attorney, a very well-known defense attorney there in Monroe, Louisiana, did say, he doesn't like for guys to have felony on their records. And it was said that, he believed it could be plead out to a misdemeanor, if not dismissed completely, just based on the fact alone that if you go and look at the police report, he has no criminal record. He has no viable background that would suit giving this kid 1 year in prison minimum is the charge for this felony, with a maximum of 5. So can you tell me that you're going to take a kid who's an all SEC player after his sophomore year and get stopped with a gun and you're going to put him in prison? I mean, I think that'd be pretty catastrophic and, it would be pretty sad to say the least. So I think that Cam is probably going to end up getting plead out. Then, of course, today, Nick Saban's on with Paul Feinbaum and basically in so many words made it sound as though that they're working closely to see what's going on, but had a pretty good feeling that Cam's going to come back and vague way of putting it. But his words were, should we keep him here where there's a process and a discipline, a structure set up, or do we just throw him to the fishes? And that makes you feel like they're going to do whatever they can to keep Cam. The thing, Mark, that you got to realize is if you lose Cam Robinson for a set amount of games, okay, let's hypothetically say he he does get plead out to a misdemeanor or it does get dismissed. Some form or fashion of discipline is going to come from Saban. You got to figure that. So from our contact, you and I are very well astute with Stephen Smith, Touchdown Alabama Magazine, good friend of ours. Reached out to him to talk to him about it, and the thought process from him was that you're looking at possibly a 4-game suspension as his discipline from Saban. If that's the case, you're looking at him missing the USC Ole Miss game, and he'd be back in time for the Kentucky matchup. Not a situation you want to be in if you're Alabama, having your star-studded offensive lineman. You already have questions as it is going into this season. I think that's probably what's more critical at this point when you start looking at it is what's the impact of this with that 2016 Alabama football team.
So in terms of Nick Saban, he has built up, as of the recent past, a reputation and a track record of taking a bit of a chance on some recruits.
Yeah.
In this case, as you pointed out, Chad, this is a situation where this kid has a clean record up until this incident. That's high school, and that's through the first 2 years of play at Alabama. So I definitely think Nick Saban is going to, the words that and the indication that he's given, I think is very telling in how he's going to handle this situation. I think it would be, even though this is a bad scene and does not look good, and the approach, the mindset, the actions of this kid and Hootie Jones as well. We focus on Robinson, obviously, because of his football playing status, but the mindset of these kids and their actions and their choices and decisions have to be completely changed, and there has to be harsh discipline. When you start talking about prison for a kid who has a clean record going into this, I completely agree. That just can't be part of it. The weapons weren't used, and again, without that record previously, I think this needs to be taken as a one-time incident, dealt with harshly. But when you talk about prison, you're talking about really changing a young man's future and really causing harm to what the athletic department and the administration could do to kind of cocoon him, protect him, and definitely enforce penalties and counsel and help without subjecting him to that kind of lifestyle and that situation for the next year. From a football standpoint, it's pretty obvious that the kid's arguably the best left tackle in college football. With others moving on to the NFL. And they've got a date. Does the Alabama Crimson Tide with the USC front? That's actually one of the weaker parts of the USC team. So that's in which Alabama catches a bit of a break. It's still a lot of talent up front for USC, but believe me, Chad, this USC front has lost tons of talent, and they have yet to replenish it. So that's one of the weaknesses of the USC team. So Alabama might be catching USC's front at the right time if Robinson misses some games, which I think that's going to be the case. They do have the Ole Miss game coming just a few weeks after that. So those are my thoughts on Saban's approach and what we've seen out of him. He's been a bit softer and more in the rehab approach concerning these type of incidents in his Alabama stay than maybe he was previous to that. We think of him being a very hard man, but when it comes to situations like this, he considers these kids, especially when they've come into the program, they've worked, they've shown accountability and responsibility. He usually sticks up for family, at least a one-time incident. And then if there's a repeated offense, then he deals with it appropriately.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really going to be the key here. And, that's going to drive a lot of people nuts in the SEC when it happens. There'll be a lot of people out there, screaming favoritism, whatever it may be, and the fact that this is in LSU's backyard, it kind of, it's a nice little storyline going into the football season. But I think the biggest thing here you got to look at is the fact that the district attorney there doesn't want to put a felony on this kid. He's usually really good at trying to work with kids and trying to make sure that they don't have a felony on their record. I think that speaks volumes, and that's coming from guys that have actually worked with him in the legal system there in Monroe. So I think that's really going to be benefit to him. The biggest thing is, can they prove that Cam didn't know that that gun was stolen? I think that's going to be the biggest thing. If they can prove that, then without a doubt, I think he goes misdemeanor, if not dismissal, period, just because of the fact this clear, he has a clean record. We talked about that. And so I think that's going to be a big deal. How Saban approaches it for Hootie Jones and Cam, I'm curious to see how that that level of discipline gets handed out. They both were in the vehicle at the same time. Granted, one's a misdemeanor, one's a felony. How does he approach it? Hootie Jones is is the lesser of the two, obviously. But that being said, I don't think that you're going to have as much publicity as this has gotten. I don't think you're going to have a lot of wiggle room here as far as how your discrepancy between the two guys and how you discipline them. So I think that's going to be something intriguing to watch as well, especially after dismissing a player here a couple of weeks ago for infractions that a guy that was basically a third stringer offensive lineman that got dismissed for basically violating team rules. So now you've got a guy with a felony and a misdemeanor. What's going to be the impact here? So I think that, be that as it may, and you know as well as I do, Mark, when you've got a star-studded player on your team, you're going to do what it takes to get him on your team and keep him there. Because at the end of the day, football's a business, and the coaches, they get paid to win games. They get paid to handle situations like this. And so they've got to find a way to overcome it, and they've got to find a way to win games. So that being said, I still think, again, he may miss some games, but like you said, if USC's defensive front is not as salty as we've seen in the past, like in the days of Pete Carroll and things of that nature, this could fall right into their hands. Ole Miss has a ton of questions on their offensive line. It could be a defensive game. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, once again, as we get closer, especially with the addition of their left tackle, freshman Greg Little. How much protection can he provide? So that's going to be pretty interesting to see, because I think the Alabama defense is going to be pretty salty as well. So not to get too far off into that, but we'll talk about that matchup later on, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was just doing a USC breakdown with an SB Nation writer, Nick Dempsey, and we ran down the depth chart, and they've lost 5 or 6 of their best players. And the best kid coming back, Kenny Bigelow, out until November. So they are paper thin along the offensive front. So the Cam Robinson loss may not be that significant against USC, although the Trojans very talented elsewhere. Chad, it's funny because the biggest gap in college football, basically in terms of news and things going on, are between the end of spring practice and the beginning of fall camp that first week of August. And those coaches, all they want is to keep these kids healthy and keep them out of trouble. That's all they need. But we still see the issues across college football, and it's inevitable. They're 18 to 22-year-old kids running all over the place and being kids, and it's going to happen. So I'm not condoning this action whatsoever, but it's going to happen to every program across the country, and certainly has. Talk a little football on the field, Chad, because I know you dug up some serious research on Texas A&M, and especially on the defensive side of the ball. Yeah. And my thoughts about the Texas A&M defense from a big picture standpoint, I think we saw it making that transition from the Big 12 in 2012 to the SEC, and that was a rough transition. And if there wasn't a certain number 2 on the offensive side of the ball to put up 45 or 50 points, it would have been a rough transition for Texas A&M. But it all glossed over because there were a lot of those 45-42 wins. And this defense, as you pointed out in some tweets that we traded back and forth, some messages back and forth, was all-time worst in some measurements, some categories. Not saying the all-time worst in the SEC overall, but if you take certain measurements, I just think the transition from the style of play that you see in the Big 12, where you got to play in space, you got to play with speed, and then all of a sudden you've got pulling guards, you got just road graders coming at you. I just think this Texas A&M defense took a couple years just from the mentality standpoint, let alone a talent or physical standpoint, just to transition from, hey, we're running around Texas Tech and Baylor wide receivers, and we're trying to chase these kids down, to, oh, we got we got two future NFL offensive linemen pulling in front of Leonard Fournette, and we got to play big man football. And just from a mindset standpoint, Texas A&M wasn't ready for it. They're catching up from a talent standpoint. The recruiting rankings would tell us that, and we've seen them buck up a little bit in the last year or two. So you can kind of explain from there what you see.
Yeah, A&M, with the addition of Chavis from LSU, obviously made strides this last year, going from 102nd in pass defense the year before to 51st under him. Of course, the rushing defense still wasn't where you want it to be. They still gave up over 2,700 yards, coming in at number 13 in the SEC this past season, which gave them like a number 8 overall total defensive ranking in the conference. And so they know that that's an area where they have to work on. Chavis came out and said that was going to be a guarantee that it was going to be much better. With Kiki, Dalen Mack, you've got Myles Garrett on one side, you got Deshaun Hall on the other. You got two great bookends. If you can get some pressure, which we talked about the fact Dalen Mack is a freshman phenom last year, and a lot of people were saying watch out for Kiki on the interior as well. Those guys could really disrupt some things. And if that defense can get any better and you allow your linebackers a little bit of space to kind of get in the gaps, and Chavis knows this better than anybody. He's done great work at LSU. We've looked at LSU's total defensive stats for the last several years, and a lot of times they're in the top 5, top 3 year in and year out, for the exception of this last year. So you take a look at that, and you know that he's going to be able to put the production and get guys in the right places. And A&M's got the talent. You made a remark about that, Mark. As far as recruiting is concerned, they've recruited a lot of really highly talented guys right there in their home state of Texas. The Houston area has been really good to A&M. And so you turn around and you've got this talent, but you've got to fix that rush defense. You go back and you look, I mean, it's 5 yards plus on average. I mean, go back to 2013, which was absolutely atrocious after their first year. Their first year in 2012 was awesome. A&M came out defensively, looked great. Had one of the better rush. Only gave up about 1,100 plus yards in rush. Gave up some yardage in pass, but they had a great, I believe it was number 8, number 9 in the SEC as far as total defense was concerned in 2012. In 2013, 2014, I mean, they're giving up massive amounts of yards per play. In 2013, gave up over 6 yards per play. And that's just a lot. Even in, I don't care what Power 5 conference you're in, that's a lot of yardage to be given up per play. So you're telling me in 2 plays, I'm giving up a first down, basically, if you look at that statistically, if you want to take that number for what it's worth. But if you want to get really granular in this thing, you can start looking at the fact that, A&M has made a lot of transitions. And again, you talked about the fact that they went from a Big 12 to an SEC. And I think that they finally made the steps to finally, get an SEC quality defensive coordinator. I think them going after Chavis was a home run. Chavis will be able to put things together there. We know that. We know that Chavis has had success. He's been at Tennessee. He's been at LSU. He's had success as a defensive coordinator. The man knows what he's doing. Secondary is his specialty. And, of course, we saw the fact that, like I said before, A&M secondary really stepped up. You go back to that 2013 season, 2,890 yards. Let me put this into just kind of a picture for everybody that's watching this right now or will watch it. If you go and you look at 2013, 2,890, 2,808 in 2014, and 2,778 this last year in rushing defense, okay? That's pretty darn close to 3,000 yards. You go back to 2008, your worst rush defense was Arkansas, and they gave up 2,049 yards. That's a pretty drastic difference between those numbers and what we're seeing from A&M. You go back into 2009, and Vanderbilt had the worst at 2,300. Okay, still a big number gap difference. You go back to 2010, Vanderbilt again, 2,300. So you're starting to see the consistency here, right, that I'm talking about. Massive difference between what A&M came in with to what, he's saying they're going to have this next year. So my thought process is when he makes a guarantee like that, it's pretty easy to do because I don't feel like you can get a whole heck of a lot worse. That being said, they've pretty much proven that you can from that 2013 season, 2014 season. So I guess there is that aspect. But I do feel like A&M with Chavis and again with the players that I mentioned, they can make a difference this year. But they're going to have to be able to, if you want to be in the SEC, if you want to get to that next level, if you don't want to be a guy that's at the middle of the road in the SEC West every year, you better have one heck of a defense, and you got to have a rush defense. And like you talked about before, yeah, you can give up the points back and forth, 45, 42 type of games, but that will not get you to the championship. And we've seen that. Just because you beat Alabama A&M does not mean that you get to the championship game. So I think that you have to correct those issues up front. Chavis knows that. They spent the entire spring harping on it. Deshaun Hall has been quoted as saying that, the guys feel a lot more experienced. They feel like they know the system a lot better. There's a lot more communication, both on the front and the back end with the secondary as well. So it seems like things are really gelling together. And if that's the case, this Chavis defense could be the saving grace for Sumlin and all the drama that we've had to deal with A&M coming out in the offseason as well.
You know what I'm seeing here, Chad, is you're racking up the numbers and really comparing the progress or lack thereof up until 2015, and then the nice step up in pass defense, but getting beat up on the ground. We saw it. I think the classic shot was the Jeremy Hill a couple Thanksgivings ago, just annihilating. No, that was Leonard Fournette as a freshman. I take that back. That was Fournette as a freshman. That wasn't Hill against, I forget who the DB was, a really good player for Texas A&M on Thanksgiving night. That's kind of the microcosm of Texas A&M playing big boy football in the SEC, not being ready for it. And as you were talking, I just wanted to double check some of the things I had thought in scanning some of these games. So I watched a lot of these games for Texas A&M this last season. So I did a little nitpicking while you were running this down, and you would expect Alex Collins, Leonard Fournette, Derrick Henry to have huge games against everybody, and they did, and also against A&M. So we'll throw them to the side knowing that they put up big numbers. But Jovan Robinson had his best rushing game of the season against Texas A&M. He ripped them up for $159. Brandon Wilds in South Carolina, they weren't running the football against too many decent teams. He ran 17 for $128 against A&M. Perry Orth, and this is the other thing that comes to the forefront, is that quarterbacks ran well out of the spread, either when the plays broke down or just running out of the spread formation in design plays. Perry Orth, 11 for 64, a nice 6 yards per carry. And as we both know in college football, that's even taken the sack yardage into account. So he probably ran for more. Dak Prescott had a 100-yard game rushing against Texas A&M. Ole Miss, and this is one of the knocks we've had against the Rebels in recent years, is they might have made it to Atlanta with a marginal rushing attack. But Jalen Walton, 22 for 97, and then the big number came right at the end of the season. They would have won a bowl game against Louisville, but Lamar Jackson ran it 22 times for 226 and 4 touchdowns against the Aggies in that 6-point bowl loss.
Yeah, that's EA video game numbers, right? 22 carries. I mean, that's 10-plus yards. That's phenomenal to me.
For a kid that can't throw the ball. So they had to be stacked up against the run.
Yeah, and that was the thing. A&M, if you go back specifically, looking at some of the Arkansas games in the last couple of years with Brett Bielema being there, you knew what was coming at you, and they could stack the box with 8 deep, and they still couldn't find a way to stop those guys. Granted, the offensive line had a lot to do with that, but still, the matter of fact is, if you're an SEC defense, you should be able to stack the box with 8 and be able to at least hold them to some type of minor yardage there. But they found a way to gash them left and right. And when you bounced them to the outside, you closed off guys like, Myles Garrett, Deshaun Hall. If you were able to put, chip blocks on them, open some things up, you can definitely make it hard on them. And that's an area where they're going to have to improve. You saw last year, even despite the fact of giving up 2,800 yards this last year on the ground, Myles Garrett, Deshaun Hall combined for 17.5 sacks. So that tells me that they were still finding ways to get to the quarterback, but yet, like you just mentioned, statistically, teams were just running it down their throat on the interior. That's an area where they have to step up, and you're going to look at a guy like Daylon Mack, and of course you're going to look at Kiki as 2 guys that have to step up for them in that position, and they're going to have to be there at the point of attack. They're going to have to be very aggressive, and I think A&M is finally kind of we're starting to see the trend now with Chavis. Chavis has come in and said, hey, you want to be an SEC caliber defense, this is what it's going to take. And I've heard nothing but the fact that they are very physical in practice. He's after them. He's getting after them. He's bringing physicality to the table. These guys are being very physical at the point of attack in practice. So that's a change in mindset, not just physicality, but also a change in the mindset and their approach. You also go from the fact that when A&M first came into this conference, they had that Big 12 secondary where a lot of times you had 5-10 yards padding between the players, and you can't do that in the SEC. SEC teams live and die by the 5-6 yard dink and dunks here and there. That's just how it works. A lot of times it's how sometimes you have to win close games that way. And so they had to adjust to that pretty quickly. And obviously, statistically, they just didn't. And teams were able to beat them up left and right on short yardage things. You could hit them underneath. And if you're doing that and you're getting 5-6 yard chunks at a time, Mark, you know as well as I do, that makes for a very long game. And your defense gets wore down really, really quickly. And I just don't think they had the depth, the caliber of depth that you see in the SEC. And, through recruiting, maybe they've got it now. And that's something I'm still interested to see. I know that everybody talks about that front four, but let's talk about the depth after those front four, because that's an area where they're going to have to really show this season. 12 games, 14 games, whatever it may be. It's a long in the SEC West. It's a long grinding season. So let's see how that depth works out for them as well.
Chad, there's a handful of programs around the country that intrigue me because of this. Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, how long is he going to stay? We know that they're going to be good. They were good last year, but are they going to be great? UCLA, Jim Moore got it started. Now he's kind of hitting a wall. We saw the definite progress for a couple of years, and now they've kind of leveled off. If you go to the ACC, what's Mark Richt going to do at Miami with that recruiting base? And is he just a 9-3 coach, or is he revitalized? We've got some glimpses of him really being energized by a new beginning there at Miami, his alma mater. In the SEC, for me, it's Arkansas and Texas A&M that intrigue me, because if you said, okay, everybody plays 12 games, what are these teams' records going to be in the next 4 years, over 48 games? I think I could come within a couple games of predicting what Alabama and LSU are going to do the next 4 years, and even Mississippi State, who's generally an 8-4 team most times. And then going out to the East, pretty much I got a gauge on everybody across the board. Missouri obviously shot out those first couple years, or their second and third years in the league under Gary Pinkel, but wow, they've got some serious challenges. Texas A&M, they come into the league, hot coach, hot quarterback. They take over Texas recruiting from the University of Texas. They're on the ascension. They win 10 games that first year, plus the bowl game. They win 11 games. They finish close to the top 5 in the country. The next year, not quite as good, but those recruiting classes are coming in at top 5, and we just expect this program's going to hit its stride. It's all coming together. And now they can't keep a quarterback on scholarship. They bring in the big recruits, but they can't keep them. They keep promising. We hear stories of promises given to these big shot recruit quarterbacks, and now there's a little dissension. There's some bad pub out there. It's not Kevin Sumlin can't do any wrong, is what the storyline was a couple of years ago. Where's this program going now? I could see them being a 6-6 program for the next 5 years, or maybe he's got a little bit of life left in him and can right the ship here.
Yeah, we'll see. And I think that's going to be the thing when you're talking about hot seats. You're talking about Stoops at Kentucky. You're talking about A&M, someone. You're talking about Auburn, Malzahn. Can Chavis, with his guarantee, save Sumlin's career, at A&M? That's the big question, because I think there are parts of the fan base that maybe are kind of becoming a little disenfranchised with him, especially after the situation with the quarterbacks broke out and the chemistry there, the promises made to not just players, but, family members as well. A lot of insight has come out, since then. Someone's been asked as of recent about that, and he's talked about the fact that there's great team chemistry. But again, those things to me are coach speak, because of the fact that we know better than that now. And so, that'll be the thing, and that's a storyline to follow. The success of A&M this season, how well they do, could seriously dictate someone's future. A&M is a school that has a lot of money, obviously, $425 million plus that they just put into renovating a new stadium. Granted, it did go over by about $75 million from what I understand. So that may have left them in a little bit of a bind. But That being said, Sumlin is in no position to be in the losing side of things in the SEC this year, and I think he's definitely got to make strides, and I think that that's something that he knows as well as the rest of the staff. So it very well could be the fact that the success of defense for A&M could be the story that you have to follow for them. If they find success, then possibly someone stays. If the defense does not progress as well as we think it does, it could be that someone finds his way out the door.
And, Chad, they welcomed Kyle Field, a team I just mentioned across the
Mm-hmm.
country, and UCLA should be an intriguing matchup there with the Bruins coming cross country with one of the best sophomore quarterbacks in the land in Josh Rosen. Then you go from game one all the way to the end of the schedule. Of course, it's a Thanksgiving battle with LSU, another team we'd like to talk about. Much ballyhooed this offseason is this LSU team coming to its own, because by LSU standards, they didn't lose that much to the NFL draft. Again, by LSU standards, still significant players going to the NFL, but they look to be fortified across the board with most likely the best running back in the game, two quality receivers that I would really love to see get the football as much as they should. And of course, Jamal Adams leading a defensive secondary that's as good as any in college football. But the quarterback situation, Chad. So LSU, is it going to be finally them breaking through and challenging Alabama like they were in the 2009 to 2011 and 12 range, or is it going to be the LSU team that beats up on everybody, but when they really face the best teams, they just don't have the offensive firepower to make it happen?
You got to think last year it was Fournette, Geis, Fournette, Geis, at times. And you just really couldn't, despite your trying, those were one of the exceptions where you load 8 guys up in a box and you just hope and pray that you get a guy in the right position to make the play. And a guy like Fournette, you can give the offensive line credit as well, but Fournette made a lot of plays on his own as well. He's just a physical beast. He's hard to get down. He's a guy that, as again, Howard Matthews found out at A&M, like you were talking earlier, he found out roughly what it was like to get trucked there and on national TV. So, I think with the addition of Damian Craig from Auburn, former Auburn quarterback, working with the wide receivers there at LSU, Cam Cameron did invite him to come and work with Harris and the quarterbacks. I think that is going to be extremely beneficial. You look at the success, I kind of relate this to another program in the SEC, and that is you look at the success that Brandon Allen had with Dan Enos, who was a former quarterback at Michigan State, coaching there at Central Michigan, becomes the offensive coordinator at Arkansas. You look at the fact that of how much success Brandon Allen and how good he looked stepping up into the pocket, just looking like he was going through his progressions. Last year would throw away the ball, not so much overthrowing the guys, but just throw the way the ball and making smart decisions at times, albeit not all the time. But that being said, the impact of having somebody who understands the game and understands what it's like to be in that pocket and has had success could be greatly beneficial to a guy like Harris. And I think that that's where an area that I'm interested to see. He's been under Cam Cameron now a couple years. When it was Harris and Jennings going flip-flopping back and forth there for a season. LSU had somewhat marginal success, but they still relied a lot on their defense and, of course, relied on the run game. This last year with Brandon Harris, it was quite obvious it was mostly Fournette. That being said, Harris had a couple 200-yard passing, but that was very few, very, very few last season. So you look at that, just come back and you say, all right, man, what's it going to be this year? He's got to be able to get it. I just want to see Brandon Harris succeed on the field. I don't want to hear about it so much anymore because I've seen him for the last couple of years and it just hasn't been there for LSU. And it seems like that has just been an area of concern for them as the quarterback position. I feel like this year, defenses are really going to try to key in on Fournette. Typically, when a player has a lot of success in the SEC the next year coming back, defensive coaches do a great job in the offseason of studying tape, and they try to limit those guys from having success. So they're going to have to find a way to get the ball in the air and have a threat that's going to make defenses at least stay somewhat honest. That being said, they're still going to feed Fournette quite a bit, but Brandon Harris is going to have to be able to pull his load at LSU this year. For them to have a lot of success, especially if we're talking about getting to the SEC championship game.
Yeah, Chad, we're in a day and an age when most quarterbacks across the country, because of the sophistication of the passing offense, because of the nature of throwing underneath quite a bit, and also because these kids come out of high school so polished and prepped that it's not uncommon for these kids to hit 65 to 68% of their passes. Now, LSU is going to take their shots downfield a little bit more than the average team, a little bit more, because they've got that kind of athlete and they want to go for the big play action pass. So you can live with, I think a good year out of Brandon Harris would be him completing 58, 59% of his passes. He had some just wretched games against marginal, and I'm being kind here, marginal opponents here. Syracuse had an awful defense. Before, despite their record, they actually had decent defenses. But last year, they were awful, like horrible secondary, bad team. 8 for 16 for Brandon Harris against Syracuse. He went 4 for 14 against a MAC team, Eastern Michigan, 4 for 14. Now, I can understand some of these lower percentage games because he went for the deep ball. Like Western Kentucky only went 11 for 20, but he threw for 286. So he was gunning it down the field, picking up big plays. But Alabama, we all watched that game gun to gun and saw how the Tide just stacked up Leonard Fournette. They didn't even think about Brandon Harris, and he could only go 6 for 19 against a defense that was locked in on the run and loading the box. That's all he could do. And we know Alabama's great, but they sold out against the run, and he could only burn them for a couple decent plays when the game was out of hand. 7 for 21 against Texas A&M. You can have maybe 1 or 2 games maybe like that throughout the year. And fortunately, because of the defense that plays on the other side of the ball and because of Leonard Fournette, he got away with most of those games against those teams. But otherwise, my goodness, he had like 3 decent games.
Yeah,
And
you
he
go
needs to
and you
be
look
better.
at that, man. The Mississippi game, he had 300 plus yards, and there was 300 plus yards passing. Still lost that game. You're right. You go back and you look at his percentages, and they're all relatively really low. I mean, when you've got some 30 and 20 percentile, completion percentages, and especially like you said against an Eastern Michigan team, you turn around, you look at 31% against Alabama, 33% against A&M that we just talked about. Which quite honestly, not surprised by the fact with Chavis being on the other side of the ball there on the other team. So I don't find that as much shocking. But that being said, I mean, some of these ratings were just awful. Yards per attempt. I mean, they have to be. I'd have to dig into it a little bit further, but they have to be some of the worst in the conference as far as a quarterback is concerned, except for maybe Vanderbilt, of course. But they've got multiple issues. But that being said. I think that Brandon Harris has just got to be able to show it on the field. Can he have success and read through his progressions? LSU's got talent. We know that, Mark. They've got talent through and through. They've got talent at depth, and that's an area LSU's never really had a problem with. Even with the changing of the guard from Saban to Les Miles. They've consistently had really talented depth there at LSU. It's easy to do when you recruit those type of guys right there in your backyard. So it's not a lack of that. It's a lack of having a quarterback, which to me is just it's shocking that LSU has struggled so mightily in the last several years since Mettenberger's success of having a good quarterback. And especially under the system with Cam Cameron, I would just assume with him coming with that NFL pedigree, that this wouldn't be an issue for LSU as much as it has been. And it makes not just me, LSU fans, maybe even some of the media pundits as well, question, is Cam Cameron the guy? Is this the system that needs to be in play at LSU? If not, maybe what saves Les Miles' job is changing of the guard or the offensive coordinator. And even that, I don't know for sure. But one thing's for sure, with the way of the state government and the way their funding and things of that nature is in Louisiana right now, they really can't afford to get rid of Les. So something's going to have to be fixed on that side of the ball. And it may just be Cam Cameron that ends up getting the boot if they don't have the success on offense that we expect them to this year.
And if Brandon Harris isn't the guy going into a third season, you would think that, yeah, that they would have been able to find somebody with all the talent that they can recruit at all the other positions, that they would have found somebody else. And that guy, as a backup, if Brandon Harris is that much of a disaster, and I don't think he will be. I think we're going to see something similar to what we saw this year, this past season, 2015. Danny Etling's a kid that gained a lot of starts at Purdue and is a serviceable backup, but you don't want to see him on the field against the better teams in the SEC. But there's not a whole lot that we're expecting out of Brandon Harris. He doesn't have to go 28 for 35 every game and throw for 350 yards. He needs to go 12 for 20 and take care of the football and hit on about 3 or 4 big plays and make teams have to respect the pass. Is all he needs to do, but the percentages have to across the board not be so sporadic and throwing for 30 and 35% completion percentage against bad teams and against key teams like Texas A&M and Alabama.
Yeah, I agree. And that's the thing. Can you win the big ones? Can he be the guy that puts the game on his shoulders and wins it for you? You know, it's really eerily similar to talking about Brandon Allen at Arkansas last year prior to the season. We're talking about Brandon Harris almost in the same light. And I think that's an area where LSU fans, I think, would be really encouraged to see him be able to go out there and you not necessarily have to depend on Fournette to win a game. And I'm not talking about an Eastern Michigan. I'm talking about either a conference game or an out-of-conference game, like, say, for example, that Wisconsin matchup at Lambeau Field, which, by the way, I think we both agree would be awesome to be there just for the historical perspective of being in Lambeau Field. But, if he's able to come in, say, in that game and makes a big difference for them and is able to put up some nice yards and put up a nice, finishes with a nice completion percentage, I think you have to feel encouraged about going into the rest of the season if he's able to do that. And I think that's going to be the first big test for Brandon Harris. We know what Fournette can do, but let's see what Brandon Harris can do in the spotlight at 2:30, in Lambeau Field against Wisconsin to kick off the season. That's going to be, it may not be dark and the lights may not be on, but I promise you national spotlight will be all over this game. So I'm looking forward to that one. And I think that's going to be the telltale for us and kind of give us a gauge of what to expect from him this season.
Yeah, and without digging into the depth charts, I think we both have a pretty good barometer on this game in regards to talent. LSU is a more talented, faster team across the board than Wisconsin. They've got a decided advantage, but it's not a huge advantage where there's some overwhelming favorite. They're going to be a solid 7-point favorite, I would think, against Wisconsin, and they should win the game. But Wisconsin's going to they had a all freshman offensive line play last year. So these guys are going to be much better this year. We're going to see more of a traditional Wisconsin running attack. They actually got away from the run last year just because they had to. They didn't have the back. They lost Melvin Gordon. They couldn't replace him. Clement was their backup the previous season. He was supposed to be the starter. He missed a bunch of games. Again, they had 4 freshman offensive linemen playing. They're going to be back to Wisconsin football on offense. They're going to be sound on defense, not extremely athletic. They did lose a couple players to the NFL, but it's going to be a game that LSU can't mess with, that they should win based on just sheer talent, but it's not going to be a blowout. It should be a rock'em sock'em game with a lot of physical play out there.
Yeah, I expect it to be, and especially being right there in Wisconsin's backyard. This having the historical feel, just the privilege of being able to be on Lambeau Field as a collegiate player. I think this is going to be a hot ticket. Tickets have been on sale already. I think the closer you get, it's going to be a sellout, no doubt in my mind. And I've also been told that the AD Barry Alvarez is thinking that possibly ESPN's game day crew shows up at that game, and that'd be another plus to that. I mean, you're talking about making it even that much more of a high profile game, but I think that's going to be the case. It's going to be one of 6 games to kick off the season that's going to be a major out of conference. So I think that in my opinion, out of those, this is the one that to me shines the brightest, just because you've got a perennial traditional SEC powerhouse going up north to play Wisconsin in their own backyard. Kudos to them for doing this for a home and home like this, or somewhat home anyways, for both of these teams. But I think this is going to be a huge game And it also, it's going to bring out the SEC haters, and it's going to bring out the trash talking between conferences because if LSU drops this one against Wisconsin in Lambeau, there'll be a lot of trash talking going on. You'll want to stay off the message boards, that's for sure.
That's right. It was probably a pretty decent compromise considering that's like a home field, but not exactly home field for Wisconsin, similar to what Wisconsin faced in going down to Reliance Stadium to play LSU at Houston 2 years ago. And that was a really good game where Wisconsin looked like they had the win. Tigers came back, won at 28-24 late. Really good football game there, and we expect more of the same at Lambeau. All right, Chad, SEC breakdown, I think, is in the books here.
Yeah, man, appreciate it. I'm looking forward to being back on with you guys regularly. We'll be definitely hooking this up and getting it out there a lot more. So I'm pretty excited about this. This is going to be fun.
So again, to let everyone know, this is SEC Breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. We post it to my channel, Mark Rogers TV on YouTube. But check us out on our Twitter page, SEC Breakdown. You got Chad Niebling here, also David Waters and Mike Laval chipping in every Wednesday night, as well as each day on Twitter on our page. Again, SEC Breakdown. And we can't forget about Ole Miss Evie as well. All right, Chad, have a good one, man. Thanks for jumping on.